The Cessna's engine screamed once, then went silent. 2,000 pounds of aircraft descended toward 70-mile-per-hour traffic on a Tuesday evening in 1972. Witnesses on the Golden State Freeway described seeing the small white plane touch down between a delivery truck and a station wagon, its wheels kissing asphalt with impossible precision. The pilot taxied to the shoulder, stepped out, lit a cigarette, and waited for emergency crews. He had done this before. That was the detail nobody could explain. A routine emergency landing on a busy highway would make regional news. What happened that evening in Los Angeles became something else entirely. A riddle wrapped in aviation fuel and highway asphalt. Dale Schroeder arrived in Los Angeles in the spring of 1971. The Iowa native carried 12,000 hours of flight time, a commercial pilot's license, and a reputation for impossible landings earned across 2 decades of barnstorming demonstrations. He was 44 years old, wire-thin, with sun-weathered skin and hands steady enough to thread a needle at 200 miles per hour. Schroeder did not perform for crowds anymore. He trained pilots for Lockheed, consulted for film productions requiring aerial realism, and occasionally demonstrated emergency procedures for aviation insurance underwriters. His students called him the surgeon for his clinical approach to aircraft control. On September 14, 1972, Schroeder signed out a company, Cessna 310, from Van Nuys Airport for a maintenance test flight. He filed no flight plan. He told ground crew he expected to be back within the hour. The aircraft carried no passengers, no camera equipment, no obvious purpose beyond transit. 3 witnesses at the airport later recalled Schroeder checking his watch twice before takeoff, as though expecting someone else to arrive.
The first highway landing occurred at 5:47 p.m. during peak rush hour. California Highway Patrol received 17 calls within 90 seconds. Officer Raymond Hicks was 3 cars behind when the Cessna touched down on the southbound lanes of the San Diego Freeway, approximately 2 miles from LAX approach corridors. His dash camera, experimental equipment rarely deployed in 1972, captured the landing from 4 car lengths away. The footage shows Schroeder bringing the aircraft to a controlled stop on the center divider, engines idling at a steady 1,600 RPM. He did not appear distressed. He did not signal for help. He climbed from the cockpit, walked to the highway's edge, and sat on the guardrail while traffic accumulated behind him in both directions. The CHP report noted no visible damage to aircraft or roadway. Aviation mechanics later confirmed the aircraft suffered no mechanical failure before landing. Schroeder told responding officers he had decided to put down here. When asked what he meant, he offered no further explanation. He requested a single telephone call, which he made to an unlisted number in Santa Monica.
What happened next troubled investigators more than the landing itself. Federal Aviation Administration Inspector Harold Vance arrived at the scene at 6:15 p.m. He found Schroeder cooperative, articulate, and remarkably composed for a man who had just parked a twin-engine aircraft on a congested freeway. Standard procedure would have required drug testing, psychological evaluation, and certificate action. Vance proceeded with all 3. The toxicology came back negative. The psychological evaluation described Schroeder as entirely rational, oriented to time and place, displaying no signs of impairment or delusion. Yet during the interview, Schroeder mentioned something that made Vance set down his pen. He said, "This isn't the first time I've used that stretch of road." Vance asked him to clarify. Schroeder explained he had landed on the same highway 18 months earlier, in March of 1971. He described the location with precise reference to mile markers and overpass identifiers. He named a date, a time, and claimed the landing had been intentional. When Vance pulled records from that period, he found no corresponding incident report, no emergency response, No documentation of any kind. The highway showed no repair work consistent with aircraft landings during that time frame. A maintenance supervisor confirmed the road had not been resurfaced since 1969. There was no physical evidence the landing had ever occurred.
The FAA opened a formal investigation 3 days later. Investigators interviewed 16 witnesses from the September landing, cross-referenced Schroeder's flight logs, and examined the Cessna's maintenance records. The aircraft showed no pre-existing conditions that would have necessitated an emergency descent. Schroeder's stated reason, that he had decided to put down, satisfied no protocol and violated multiple federal aviation regulations. Yet the aircraft's instrumentation told a peculiar story. The altimeter had been manually reset twice during the flight, a behavior inconsistent with standard procedures. The heading indicator showed a consistent 180-degree deviation from the planned test route. The fuel gauges read full at takeoff and nearly full upon landing, indicating the aircraft had not consumed fuel as expected for a 40-minute flight. Vance noted in his final report that these inconsistencies suggest either instrument malfunction or deliberate manipulation. He recommended certificate action against Schroeder for reckless operation of aircraft. Before the recommendation could be reviewed, Schroeder requested a meeting with FAA headquarters in Washington. He claimed to possess information of national significance related to his highway landings. He requested immunity from certificate action in exchange for testimony. The request was denied. Schroeder then did something unexpected. He resigned his positions with Lockheed and disappeared from public aviation records for 6 weeks.
When Schroeder resurfaced in November 1972, he brought a leather-bound flight journal and a proposition. He offered the journal to the Smithsonian Institution's National Air and Space Museum, accompanied by a handwritten letter describing his highway landings as controlled demonstrations of survivable emergency procedures for public education. Museum curator Dr. Ann Whitfield reviewed the journal and found it unremarkable. Standard flight logs, maintenance notations, fuel calculations. One entry caught her attention. Dated March 7, 1971, the entry read, 1550 hours, Highway 101, Santa Monica, third observation, landing confirmed, no recovery possible, regroup required. The language suggested something beyond casual experimentation. Third observation implied previous attempts. No recovery possible suggested a failure. Regroup required implied a larger operation with defined objectives. When Whitfield contacted Schroeder for clarification, his telephone had been disconnected. His Van Nuys apartment had been vacated. His emergency contact listed a P.O. box in El Paso, Texas, which contained nothing but blank paper. The journal itself disappeared from museum records within a week, reportedly lost during a facility renovation. No staff member recalled seeing it after Whitfield's initial review. Mainstream aviation historians have largely settled the matter. Dale Schroeder, they argue, was a skilled but troubled pilot who sought attention through increasingly bizarre demonstrations of his abilities. The psychological profile supports this. Schroeder's colleagues described him as introverted to the point of isolation, with few personal relationships and no family connections. His resignation from Lockheed suggested a man in personal crisis. The 1972 landing, according to this interpretation, was a cry for help dressed in aviation terminology. The missing flight journal was likely destroyed by Schroeder himself, as it contained evidence of additional unauthorized landings he wished to conceal. The third observation notation refers to nothing more than personal record-keeping by a man obsessed with his own competence. The FAA's denial of his immunity request and his subsequent disappearance reflect the natural conclusion of a publicity-seeking pilot who overplayed his hand. This explanation satisfies the documentary record. It does not explain why Schroeder knew the mile markers of a highway he claimed to have landed on 18 months before anyone documented such a landing.
Three details resist easy categorization. First, the dash camera footage from Officer Hicks shows the Cessna's landing gear extended and locked 45 seconds before touchdown. Standard emergency procedure requires fuel dumping, mayday calls, and runway assessment. Schroeder performed none of these. He descended directly onto live traffic, suggesting he had already determined the highway would be clear at his chosen point. Second, Schroeder's telephone call from the highway went to a number registered to a defense contractor specializing in aerial surveillance. The company, Meridian Systems Incorporated, held classified contracts with the Department of Defense through 1975. No record exists of any communication between Schroeder and Meridian representatives. Third, a ground crew member at Van Nuys Airport reported seeing two men in civilian suits photographing the Cessna before Schroeder's test flight. The men left before takeoff and did not return. Their names were not recorded. Their employer remains unknown. These details connect the highway landing to something larger than one pilot's personal pathology.
Consider an alternative interpretation. What if the highway landings were not demonstrations, but retrievals? What if Schroeder was not acting alone, but as part of an operation requiring aircraft to land at specific locations at specific times for reasons that remain classified? The defense contractor connection, the suits at the airport, the missing flight journal, these suggest a shadow program operating beneath public awareness. Schroeder's claim that he had landed on the same highway 3 times could describe a pattern of drops or pickups designed to avoid conventional aviation infrastructure. The no recovery possible notation might refer to equipment or personnel that could not be extracted by normal means. His request for immunity in exchange for testimony suggests he possessed knowledge that others were willing to suppress. When his request was denied, he vanished, not because he was unstable, but because his usefulness had ended. The official narrative of a troubled pilot serves a purpose. It closes the file on an incident that might otherwise demand continued investigation. Dale T. Schroeder died in 1989 in a nursing home outside Phoenix, Arizona. His obituary made no mention of highway landings, Lockheed employment, or classified defense work. It described a career in commercial aviation and memberships in 3 aviation associations. His ashes were scattered over the Pacific Ocean per his written instructions. The Cessna 310 he flew in 1972 was sold at auction in 1975 and disappeared from aviation registries by 1980. No federal agency maintains an open file on the incident. The dash camera footage remains in the California Highway Patrol archive, uncatalogued, partially deteriorated. Attempts by aviation historians to obtain release of the recording have been denied under Exemption 7 of the Freedom of Information Act, which protects records or information compiled for law enforcement purposes. No law enforcement proceeding followed the 1972 landing. What law enforcement purpose justifies continued suppression of 49-year-old footage? Next episode tease. Next week on Phantom Atlas, the lighthouse keeper who documented an impossible ship and what the ship's manifest revealed about the cargo it was never supposed to carry. Script complete. Word count, approximately 1,180 words. Runtime, 8 at 148 WPM narration pace.